So if you are just joining us, you are seeing the agenda right now for kind of what our next few weeks will look like. We talked about this on the last profiling call last Friday. We want to make sure that we close the loop also on the governance side as well. I think, many of you attend both calls. But just as a heads up, we got confirmation folks would kind of attend and would be able to kind of participate on the governance call today, but that on the 27th and January 3rd, we anticipated that we wouldn't have nearly as many or any attendees. So right now, unless we hear differently, kind of in lieu of the holidays, we'll be returning and keeping our current sequencing by returning on January 10th with our profiling call. So that means we'll miss one profiling call and one governance call at the kind of the edge of December and into January. But I'm sure many of you will be looking forward to having the time off and getting a little bit of mental break from things. So as a heads up, you will be seeing those cancellations for those 2 sessions come through on the Info Central calendar, as well as I typically will, like when I cancel them out on Zoom, just send you guys a reminder email indicating when we'll resume, which will be January 10th, which is crazy to think that it will be a whole another year before we chat next. So I've got, that is just a logistical update. With the focus today, we'll have, to Elliot's point, an announcement around some terminology server capabilities to kick things off. And we will be continuing our discussion and kind of review of the relationship between other kind of established national bases and cores where both exist, with diving in today, particularly around the Dutch Zibs core, which is when we haven't really had a chance to really engage on previously, as we kind of looked at Australia over the last 2 sessions and probably have some outstanding questions that we'll want to make sure we share with our team. So let me just see if I can get the link to that announcement into the deck before handing it off to Elliot on that first one. Oh, perfect. Thank you. All right, so Elliot put a link in the chat on the announcement that went out on Info Central earlier this week. I will let you take it away, Elliot. You're on mute, just a heads up.
So this is a effort that we started actually on this call, where we were talking about making use of InfoWay terminology in CA baseline. And we now have this InfoWay terminology server is fully integrated into the HL7 tooling ecosystem. So what that means is if we go to the HL7 terminology server that's used for validation and implementation guide building, I just pasted it. Okay, so if you go to tx-reg there, and you can see all of the terminology servers that are integrated. And so there's the HL7 ones. There's Australia, who's the first national affiliate. There's France, who's the second national affiliate, and we are the third to have our terminology in there. And so when you're building an implementation guide with IG Publisher, it knows how to resolve all of the terminology that's hosted on the InfoWay terminology server, which is great. Makes things really easy to do, to use. Now, to make use of it, you need to go to InfoWay's discussion of their terminology server, but actually from there, you need to get an account. In order to use it, you need an API key that IG Publisher can present to the terminology server to let your requests succeed. But yeah, it's all working really nicely. There's a couple of bumps still that we're trying to figure out. Certain value sets aren't expanding quite correctly, and I'm working with Graham to, I think it's problems with the HL7 terminology server and how it's being used, or the publisher, but from the InfoWay point of view, everything is working great. So it's been about 3 months of effort on and off, and thanks to Tarek and Anil and Ken at InfoWay and the Daedalus team who are supporting the server, and then obviously Graham Grieve with HL7 and David Odisek. Adding this in required sort of basically a top to bottom rewrite of the networking stack within the IG publisher, because we are the first affiliate to require authorization to access the terminology. And so they needed to make sure that gets passed around everywhere. But it's there, it's working now. As I said, there's a couple of bugs to iron out, but basically you can now use InfoWay terminology directly in your implementation guides.
Elliot, it's Shannon. Can I ask a quick question?
Yep.
When you say the first affiliate to require authorization, what does that mean exactly? Is that just because it's like behind the like login on Info Central?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you go to the French terminology server, or you go to the Australian terminology server, you can directly get to their terminology without a login.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Ours is the only one that requires it. And I don't know what the reason is, why they've decided that they don't require a login and why InfoWay has decided we do. But yeah, and actually it's for the publication process and validation process, it's not a login, it's an API key.
Right.
That proves that InfoWay has approved you to access this.
Okay. Gotcha.
AODA would be, is that
No,
disabilities?
accessibility, yeah, but I would suspect it has something to do with agreeing to the terms and conditions for SNOMED.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I don't
But
know
I
for
don't-
sure. If someone from InfoWay could probably confirm, but
I believe that's it, but I don't know why InfoWay requires agreement, but Australia and France don't.
That's a good question.
Yeah. If you scroll down the page, you can actually see. So Australia says they are the authoritative source for SNOMED CT Australian edition, and for these various Australian health code systems. We've said essentially the same thing for us. So if we're both serving up the same kind of content, why one requires agreement and the other one doesn't, I don't know.
Yeah.
So, Elliot, what this
Yes.
means for iGuide authors that want to leverage the capabilities of expansion for display or for validation is that we will effectively need to register to get the API key and then
Yeah.
apply, I know we've looked at it in the past in the baseline, but apply essentially some terminology. Is it expansion parameters and configuration file that allows to pass that API key so that when we want to expand out the value sets that previously we've kind of stubbed out, that our
Right.
items are capable of doing that, right?
Yeah, let me just pull that up for 1 second. There's
I
two
can stop sharing
files
if you want to
need.
share too, but
No, I'm very good not sharing right now. There's two files that you need to set up. The first one is your FHIR settings in your .FHIR directory. That is configuring your API key. The other thing is an expansion parameters file if you want to use SNOMED CT and tell it to choose the Canadian edition. And that gets added to your implementation guide.
so we'll like when we start doing this in the baseline, there'll be like a settings. So if this was my FHIR
Yep.
folder, there'll be like a settings one here. And then in the baseline, I think we also have an input. I think we'd have to add in an expansion parameter
Exactly.
here. Okay.
Yeah.
And that will just go on GitHub as well as be used locally, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so actually one of the things that we did as part of setting this up is the IG auto build system has an API key. So it's allowed to call into the Infoway server and get its terminology. So if you do an auto build, that will be available. But if you're building locally, you need to set that file up yourself.
Okay. And I think we'll probably do like a dedicated session where we actually just make the changes together on the IG baseline.
Yeah.
Or the IG baseline, on the CA baseline. So that hopefully folks that are wanting to do this similar in their implementation guides can make those same changes. But I am going to just add these into, so we've got a starting point when we do that proper full-on walkthrough on one of the profiling calls. Were there other questions that folks had? I mean, or just, generic celebrations for the giant push that it's taken to get to this point that folks want to share?
So maybe just to help clarify, if someone were using the HL7 validator or IG publisher, do they need to do anything different?
They need to have that FHIR settings file present.
Okay, so it's not automated just because it's connected to Graham's terminology service.
Correct.
Okay.
And if you're using a validator other than the HL7 one, I don't know how you would pass that setting in to tell it to use the API key. I had a chat this morning with Ward from Simplifier about how they could potentially hook into this. So there may be some development on that side too.
Elliot, so yeah, just wondering who will be the contact if we need any assistance while configuring our systems with this API?
So I can help you setting up your FHIR settings file. If you want to reach out to me or reach out on Zulip for that part of it. I don't know who the contact at Infoway is or the email at Infoway to actually get assistance with getting the API key?
I think there is a process for that already. Would it be here?
Yeah, I think it's this one, right?
Yeah.
Be on the system account, yeah.
Just to see if there's like. Yeah, it looks pretty well documented.
Well, this is for two uses. One is for the API key, but there's also talking on this page about how to do OAuth. Oh, right there. That's it, exactly.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments that folks have?
I was just gonna say we should have this documented, but appears it is.
And if you find something that should be documented, please provide that feedback.
Awesome. Anything else? Come on, guys, I'm waiting for the bullhorns, like. I think maybe once we actually see like how it works in the baseline and like can show like people like, oh, this is the before and after. This is the terrible hell that is stub value sets versus, oh, this is an expanded version of that value set we've been referencing. That's maybe when it will start like really clicking for folks what a big step up for the baseline this is going to be, and for their other guides, obviously.
We're just looking at this from the point of view of if we get our own terminology server up and running, how are we gonna link it into everything too?
Right. So my discussions with Graham is that he seems fairly open to adding in additional servers. There doesn't seem to be a federated way to do this. So I guess that's the, where you ask HL7, HL7 asks InfoA, InfoA asks Alberta. That doesn't seem to be possible. You have to go directly to HL7 International to get your server listed.
Yeah, I think that's gonna be, I mean, well, that's the way they've got it working right now. I think that's probably not a stable future state.
Yeah, I think the other question or consideration is, why do you need your own terminology server?
Just to host our own term sets.
But you can do much of what you need distributing the terminology via an implementation guide. And so it really becomes useful when you aren't distributing the terminology in an implementation guide, or you've got, for example, SNOMED CT or LOINC are huge. And so it's not practical to put it into a code system resource.
Well, it's kind of not practical to put it in the IG when you're using a code system across multiple different use cases, which use different IGs.
But you can have a base IG that all of them would depend on.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
But
But yeah, I think it's an interesting question as to when you want terminology distributed like this through a terminology server versus when you distribute the terminology through an implementation guide.
our challenge is we've got to try and we sort of have the Alberta Health Services has a collection of terms that they use to map between their application and provincial standards. We need to go keep a place to store the Alberta standards that are accessible, which is going to go really beyond just FHIR terms. We could use it for anything. They just require to hit the terminology server, for example, to get the term set, but have that availability. Because right now we have like a whole bunch of corporate code tables that are all sitting on our database, but because the database is locked down, nobody can see what they are. Whereas if
Yeah.
term server running, we could put that information up there and then everybody in the province could see it pretty easy.
Mhm.
So
It is
that's
also possible to run a local copy of tx.fire.org and point your tooling at it. And then you can host on that server everything, all of your organizational terminology. And that doesn't require you integrating into the ecosystem. And as long as your tooling points to that server, everything should work.
but you have to be able to get to all the different term sets so that, I mean, either we've got to make a complete copy of all of InfoWays, all of HL7 and anybody else we're using on ours and keep those up to date to point at it, because the issue is right now the validators can only point at one term server instead of
Right.
two.
But you can, just like tx.fire.org can redirect to other ones, like InfoWays, if you had your own local copy of it, of
Yeah.
tx.fire.org, it could also federate out to InfoWay and other places. The only thing is that there's a certain minimal set that actually has to be on the terminology server. And I had a hard time. I was trying to run my own terminology server while I was testing this. And it's not well understood to me, and I'm not sure Graham has put effort in to figure out, is it possible to run just like a shell terminology server that forwards everything to tx.fire.org or to one of the other configured terminology servers, or looks local for your local code sets? Because that would be the ideal in my mind.
Yeah,
But I don't know how to set that up, and I don't know if Graham has thought about how to set that up.
but it's something they should be, because it'll make life easier in the FHIR space, because I'm sure we're not the only place that's looking to say, well, we got our own terms that we need to be able to hit, plus we want to use the common terms.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think BC and Ontario might also be doing something similar.
Yes, and we do have some challenges in BC too, similar as Alberta, means our local value sets where to host, or but I don't know, means I think this terminology, sir, as Elliot was mentioning, that we can use that one, but what we heard from CHI that they will publish only if it is being used by more than one jurisdiction, only those value sets. But if it is only local to one jurisdiction, they may not be putting it there. So
Right.
we
That's
need
what,
to explore. Yeah,
that's basically why we need the Alberta server and you need a BC server
correct. Yeah.
to handle.
Mhm.
But it's good that at least we got progress here in a direction we can get something going. And
Yeah.
it will be useful.
I mean, I think it's useful to have a conversation with Graham about sort of what that would look like. I give him till after the holidays because he's been working really hard to get us to this point. And I don't want to say, thanks a lot, Graham, but
Here's this other mouth.
Yeah, I think it will be nice if jurisdiction can host their own subsets, as we had on Terminology Gateway earlier. Yes, you can publish your subset as an additional value set. So that will definitely big help for all the jurisdiction. So then they don't need to explore their own local terminology server, but they can just go to the main one, and that will be very, very, very helpful for all the jurisdiction, I believe.
So a lot to talk about, I think, in the new year, in this topic space. So I'm curious if we think it would be meaningful, so I think we know the kind of practical application of this will happen in the profiling calls, but if folks would think it would be helpful to try to have a standing up like agenda item on some of our governance to talk about kind of the terminology considerations, and we have to keep it to a baseline perspective, but it sounds like obviously there's still a lot of discussion to be had and things to explore, if that would be helpful to folks.
I'm sure some value would be there for us. At least to help everybody try and come up with a similar strategy, so we're not asking for 10 different ways to solve it.
Yeah, I think the challenge will be like that there are probably some conversations that we can have from the baseline perspective, but it may be more limited than the use cases you guys are discussing. So, you know, I think having the avenue on our calls to kind of talk through what we're encountering, and then thinking about how you might continue those conversations off call and like other groups will be important too, because there's probably only so many use cases that we'll run into practically from the baseline perspective of like, we don't host or generate a lot of our own content for terminology. So there might be some limitations there, but I think it's a good start, certainly. And we've got plenty of engaged people that are impacted in the space that seem to want to talk about it. So if there are any other updates, I'll let folks get them in now. Otherwise, I think I put all the links into the actual PowerPoint, and then you'll have access to them obviously through the chat as well if you're interested in playing around over your holiday. Any other comments before we go into the next part of the agenda, which is kind of talking about base and core review and returning to that discussion?
That's perfect timing because I have to drop now. I'm sorry.
All right. Thanks, Elliot.
Happy holidays to everyone.
Happy holidays.
Get that.
All right. So for the second part of the agenda, and I don't anticipate we'll get through all of it today, but you know, what we're trying to do is look at, as part of this overall larger discussion that we're having around what is their sweet spot for the baseline, and what is the sweet spot continue to be, or like as we start to have more formalized implementation guides like the core and the CACDI and you know, use case guides in place. And in trying to figure out, okay, well, from a mechanical perspective, what that could be, one of the approaches that we've said is, well, let's look at, you know, there aren't a lot of other countries that are doing base and core, but the ones that are, let's look at their approaches. Let's look at how they describe the relationships between those two things. Like, are they operating in a very similar approach as each other? And is there things that we can glean from their way of doing things that we think is appropriate and makes sense for our community? So we spent some time looking at the Australian Basin Core. At last session, one of the things that we said was we just try to kind of come up with, well, what are we actually scanning for? Like, what are the things that when we're looking at content that's published by some of these other groups, what is it that we want to drill into? And so we kind of nailed down you know, we want to understand how they describe the differences between purpose and conformance, and for a base versus core, and how that translates into the choices they make and the constraints that they apply in their profiles. We want to understand like how they organize their profile lists across both types of guides. You know, are they one-to-one? Are they actually like distinct profiles in each? We want to understand like how the approach influences the actual application of constraints or application of extensions and terminology. And notably, like how they actually talk about their relationship to each other and to other guides in the space. And we've done that for the most part. We've dug into, like, I would say a lot of these spaces for base and core in Australia. I think that we started to look a little bit last time at like how one of the IPS guides for Australia was leveraging base and core. And as I started to prep the materials for this call to see if we could dive a little bit further into that with the Australian National Guides, what I found was actually there was a couple different distinct drafts, and each of them had a slightly different tweak to how their patient summary profile was utilizing the base or core Australian profiles. And so rather than try to jump between all three of those guides and try to like gauge which one's source of truth and like what are they evaluating, because it's still very early days for them, what I thought might make sense is like to have this be one of the areas that we specifically kind of ask them to provide further clarity on, so that we're not making incorrect assumptions about how other guides are using them when we don't necessarily have something to point to distinctly from Australia for like patient summary, for example. So, but I think it like this provides a nice recipe for us to do the same type of, you know, scan and looking at the approach that's applied within the ZIBs and core in the Netherlands, which is something that Anil had brought up on our last call. And notably, when I was trying to do a refresher on where some of the other patterning of bases and cores has occurred, is one of the only other nations, right, at least from what we know right now, that is kind of mature enough where they have both of those in place today. So what I thought we might do is kind of follow a similar process. I figured I might just do a really quick high level like walkthrough of what was true earlier in the year that we were able to validate in terms of like the patterning that's present, and then maybe like have us look at the documentation in their guides and look at these examples similar to what we did last call. I'll put this link in the chat. So there is a group of us that meet pretty intermittently, usually around like the working group meetings, that I'll put the second one. It's just like the national IGs that are being implemented and like the patterning that's being applied. And one of the activities that we did in the last year was effectively scanned how bases, cores, regional and like use case driven guides were interacting with each other, and tried to have discussions around like, are there similarities in our patterning? Are there downsides to each of their approaches? Are there blind spots that we anticipate that we're going to have to solve over the next year? And so what I wanted to point out was, even at this time, and again, this might have changed because this is probably 8-9 months old. There were only a few folks that had this kind of base and kind of core and use case level in place. You know, we, in, you know, 8 months, 9 months ago, when we started putting this together, we knew that there was the core that was being kind of like being established, but we had this kind of awkward positioning in the baseline when we actually compared it against some of the other approaches of the other nations, where we kind of straddled the line between the types of things that often go into this use case generalized profile and use case agnostic profile. But if you actually kind of scan through a lot of these, like, and many of these are at different levels of maturity, right? So at the point in time of the scan, Estonia had just started putting out their base. That there really isn't a ton that actually has this kind of base core plus some degree of kind of use case driven guides. But you can see that there is quite a lot of diversity, right? So I think that tells us two things. One is that we're not alone, I think, in having, like, in this place where we are, which is we have this kind of established set of practices, but we have emerging guides that are that are making us have to think through the kind of maturity and long-term patterning approach. But also that, you know, we do have some examples that we can look to, and we can learn what's been working, what hasn't been working. And right now, at least from like the scan earlier in the year, we have kind of Australia, the Netherlands, and I think maybe a little bit of Norway that we can look at and kind of check back in and to see what's changed since. So if we're looking at the Netherlands example, before we dive in, they really kind of describe both their core and their what they called ZIBs, which was like the modules that describe like the clinical information modeling, but not necessarily like the constraints for particular use. Both of them exist at the use case agnostic level, but they do have a relationship to each other, and they have a relationship to other guides and profiles that are in use in country, right? For I think one of the more important kind of considerations of this pattern is that a lot of the content that's developed at the kind of ZIB and core level are managed through one particular organization, a standard steward. And then there's implementation profiles that are wild in the community that are managed by other organizations that have these kind of derivative or imposed relationships. So when we actually look at that, there's some documentation on their actual relationships that we can look at in their wiki page. And then we can actually kind of try to see how this plays out, in the actual profiles themselves. So it's been a while since I read this, so I think we're going to be like scanning through this for the first time together. But this is, and I'll put it in the chat, you'll have to probably do Google Translate, which is basically, I did, let me actually just see if it'll refresh. Yeah, if it doesn't prompt you, you can just go translate to English by right-clicking. But this is the link specifically to describe the relationship between like what the ZIBs are supposed to do, what the Newfoundland or the Netherlands core is supposed to do, and how specific implementation profiles are supposed to operate. And I might actually just go a little bit further up to just give you the ZIBs introduction first. You see the first time. Yeah, so care information building blocks. So these are effectively the rules for data types and the rules for, a particular type of record, how that would be expressed within the Dutch context. And so when they use the term ZIB, that is kind of the highest level, just like kind of a base would be in Australia for conveying these kind of patterns over time without necessarily putting on constraints. So ZIBs are defined by the program. Hold on, let me just see. ZIBs are defined by the program, data capture at source, and they're use case neutral building blocks from which use cases can be built. So they're not necessarily like, my understanding of the ZIBs is that they are kind of almost like what we're hearing and describing in the larger Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework, in that they're like not tied to a standard and they cover a really broad range of pieces of information, and that you can add constraints and you add use cases over time to say, here's how these pieces fit together and how the blocks are used.
Sheridan, it's Shannon.
Yep.
Just chiming in to say that we met with the folks from NICTIS about this, like the framework team, and that's exactly what they said. Like that was exactly the synergy that we sort of identified between the two as well.
And I think that it's probably that's both intentional and mostly organic in nature too, because we need this ability to describe how we'd like information to be modeled independent of how it's going to be exchanged.
Exactly.
And so I'm glad I represented it faithfully, because it's been a little bit since kind of dove into the content. But like, from this perspective, when we start then looking at the kind of how do ZIBs relate to what they call this NL core, I think you got the high level of what the ZIBs do. From the core perspective, it says they derive from the ZIB profiles and might be further enriched by concepts for different use cases that need the ZIB. I might just jump to this. So the core layer ensures similar concepts defined at the use case level are implemented in a uniform way at the FHIR level. So something that I think is interesting is that like ZIBs are their own thing, but ZIBs also have FHIR profiles. And then the Newfoundland core layer, like definitively also, I'm sorry, I keep saying Newfoundland, the Netherlands core layer also have this kind of inherent FHIR level to them as well. Concept may be used by single or multiple use cases. However, that's irrelevant because adopting this level provides like a clear guidance on future use. So they call this the intermediate level. And only valuable if they can be reused across situations. So these wouldn't be like probably a singular use case and then never used across other use cases. Therefore, it should be investigated how a concept can be created in such a reusable way. If there's a vanishingly small opportunity for use, then it's best to define at the use case level. So if we go back to kind of this view, this is probably why they pulled up the, rather than like placing their Netherlands core here, they've kind of basically said, well, use cases are their own thing. There should be some level of generalization across multiple use cases that the core considers. So it says extensions from use cases should usually be generalized and added to the core layer. Reference types to specific profiles should usually be done at the NL core layer. I'm gonna have to, oh, I'm guessing this would be like, if you've got a service request, the actual reference to a provider would like if you were going to constrain that would be likely what shows up in the core layer. Cardinalities determined by the ZIBs and further restricted by the use cases. So it makes little sense to implement them at the core layer. That's part's interesting. One thing I've seen that we'll probably see when we look at the examples today is that they're very careful in where they actually apply cardinalities in the ZIBs as well. They tend to be kind of more open world, more flexible at that level. Says implemented. Okay, so I'm guessing like the majority of any true restrictive cardinalities is happening at that use case level. Mappings to functional specifications for use cases are by definition use case specific and should be added at that layer. Bindings are usually use case specific. So this is really interesting because if we're thinking back to like what we saw in the AU basin core, there are more broad exchange bindings, particularly like, oh, the SNOMED value set in from the Australian edition. We see this getting added in very commonly in like the AU base and the AU core, whereas it sounds like they might show up we might see them in some in the core profiles, but are more likely to be use case specific. But we'll check the work, see if that's also the pattern that we see in place. And then search parameters are the other kinds of things that they call out for this layer, generalized and added into the core layer. So if we jump back, then the last kind of layer to consider is information standard specific. So this would be derived profiles from the core. So this is like when we think back to the things that we're trying to scan for, it sounds like the relationship is follows this hierarchy rather than jumps and creates derived relationship or inheritance relationships between the implementation standards and the ZIBs. So it seems like it's a full flow through or flow down. Okay. So I think we can come back to the wiki, but I just want to solidify our understanding of these concepts and how they show up by looking at then how they actually show up in the profiles themselves. So I've got, I just did the R4 ZIBs. Something that I think was confusing to me at first is I thought, oh, there would be a project for ZIB and a project for core in the NICTIS library. But there seems to be, it seems that they house both of them in this kind of NICTIS R4 ZIB library, because this is the like essentially the FHIR project for both ZIB and core. Whereas like a lot of the documentation on like how are these used and how do the actual implementation rules come into place are housed on wiki. They don't necessarily have this kind of same guide that like we've taken to supplying content via simplifier in the guides. But let's look at ZIB patient. And I've got, so I think I chose the right one. So I tried to get a version of ZIB patient, a version of the core patient. This is again from the same library. And then in thinking about this, I tried to pull up their example of a woman who it's an implementation of the patient profile for this particular context around some pregnancy related use case that I don't know the translation of. But let's take a look at the base and the core first, or the ZIB and the core first. So if we're expanding the ZIB, we've got some extensions. Nationality, which appears to be, it's them utilizing a standard FHIR extension and further supplying, it looks like some modeling for the code. So modeling and mapping, I guess, which is not necessarily noted directly in the wiki that we went over, but that applies. This seems to be like one of the things that they're trying to like convey. So I think this is the mapping maybe to the, I don't know if this is to V3 or to like the actual item in the ZIB. But they are supplying it at this ZIB level rather than somewhere else. But then they have this for this extension that they're leveraging. It looks like they're also supplying a constrained NICTIS generated code system, maybe. Go back. Okay, so this is like everything that's recognized in the under the Netherlands kind of context. So it's a code system that is published and bound as extensible in this extension. So, I mean, that's to some degree still a substantial constraint to say, hey, if you're going to use a nationality extension, if you're implementing in Netherlands, you should be using something from our extensible code list. They have got some modeling similar to like what we have, I think we've seen in the AU base and some of what we kind of have in place for patterning for the CA baseline, which is a national identifier. It looks like this is them utilizing their own identifier system as as how they're creating this distinction to, I'm guessing this is like one of the Dutch national identifiers, BSN. But patterning is limited, right? You don't got like, you don't see must supports or cardinality constraints. It's really just to say, hey, if you're supplying this identifier, we would have anticipated you'd model it with this particular identifier naming system. When we get into patient name for ZIBs, that's where we start to see, like, I guess this would be like where the wiki called out some underlying cardinality constraints in place. I didn't look into this invariant, but they also have one of the things that they do that I think we saw a little bit of it in the Australian example is they also profile their data types. So within this, they basically say, go back. If you are providing a human name, then I would interpret this to say, then a max of 2 will be supplied with potentially a name usage extension, additional information on use. There's some extensions that are modeled here, but for the most part, except for given, the constraints are pretty loose. They're modeling of the extension without necessarily necessitating its use. So definitely an approach that we've kind of talked about in the past. However, I think our current modeling largely has these as like, because we haven't dove in this much into the kind of data type profiling, has these transparent without trying to kind of put these into another kind of abstract profile itself. So certainly a consideration. Let me just see if there's another. So the other thing I wanted to just call out that I had seen in their wiki was like no must supports necessarily identified within the ZIBs. I don't actually know if we'll see any in the core either, but we'll see. There, it looks like they've got a lot of mapping, and then in some places they've got this like this I, so they've got additional constraints they've applied at the invariant level. So these are rules that are generic enough to say if you supply a prefix for a family name, then chances are you should be supplying the family name that that prefix belongs to. Seems reasonable and pretty loose. And then the same for partner, it looks like. and some required bindings, which is interesting. That's slightly different than what we saw when we looked at Australian base. If we then, I'm just going to pull up the core version. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to do is actually see if they make any claims to derive from the base. It looks like they do. So their core base definition inherits all of the things from the snapshot in the zib. So their base. I'm going to just use that synonymously for the purpose of this conversation. I'm going to go to differential so we can actually see what they've added on or changed. So it looks like that name information slice that we looked at might have additional constraints. So you can see they've got here's the original one that came from the zib that we looked at. Here's the additional core one that got added on. If parts of the name are specified using one or more of the structural elements, the text element should be populated. So some should kind of warning invariance. And it looks like they might have also further reprofiled this data type to add mappings. And yeah, this is the same one that we just were looking at, I think. It's interesting. We haven't really talked about like this too much, like where the baseline's sweet spot is in terms of conveying mappings, but certainly something to see if it comes up in other comparators. Okay, I'm still in zib patients. Let me go back. Okay, looks like, again, a further reprofiling of address and some of these other ones. But they don't seem to touch any cardinality in the patient profile, which I guess is kind of what they said they would do, like leaving cardinality to the implementation guides.
Sheridan, do you know if they correlate to the same version for the zip, meaning it's always synchronized when it comes to codependency?
So these are both housed in the same guide. And for the base definition, it looks like they just call out this, like it's not versioned in any way.
Mhm.
So I would anticipate that if you looked at, so they have an STU3, so it's technically, I'm going to draw this parallel with like a different version of FHIR, but it would be like a different release in the sense. I'm going to guess they probably follow the same thing, which is there's probably a zib and a core profile for patient. And it's oh, interesting. I wonder what the zib one is. My guess is that they're controlling it. Well, this is an earlier version, so maybe they didn't have the zip one at that time. Somewhat through projects, but that like if you were to host your zib profile and your core profile in the same project, and you were to say, well, they're dependent on each other, then they would just whatever the time of your packaging was or your rendering here, use whatever the point in time was for the parent. Does that make sense? Like,
No, it does, because it's like you mentioned, it's hosted on the same project. I just wondered if there's any exceptions here.
well, let's see. Oh, hold on. I'm going to open this up. A lot of times when they're not hosted in the same project and we're trying to say, hey, they're like, we want to have better control. And it looks like maybe there is some history of this. We would designate like the version that we're dependent on if it wasn't hosted in the same project through dependencies. So we would say, oh, I have a dependency on, the zib beta 1, release. So that's the other way without having to actually make that claim on your profile itself, because that becomes then just another thing you have to update over time. You control that at a high level through the versioning you're applying in your package dependencies. We've got like another minute. I just wanted to see the BC woman one, which was this. And there might be a better version for us to look at the next time. What I was really curious is I wanted to see for an implementation guide, like where they started applying like the must supports and much more restrictive invariance and much more restrictive cardinality constraints. This one may not be the best example. I think I can probably see if we can pull another one that's Netherlands based. But one of the things I just wanted to like go over was like, when you have this implementation, which in their case is housed in a different guide, like, are they deriving from the core or are they deriving from the ZIB? And at least with this one, they're deriving directly from the core, which in that sense carries the ZIB's constraints, because the core, it's like they automatically inherit from the ZIB because the core inherits from the ZIB. But they also do things like, I guess, add additional extensions that are very use case specific. Let's see if I guess they add mappings. I was kind of thinking we might see something where like they modify the bindings, but this might be a patient is one that doesn't actually usually have a ton of other bindings. So I think we like to summarize, there's definitely some similarities to some of the modeling that we're seeing in the Australian approach. At least in terms of the relationship between base, core, and other implementation guides. There's, I think, distinct differences in the use of maybe extensions and where they get socialized. And there is a deviation between the two in, one that chooses to apply must supports, and I think considerably more bindings at the core level, and obligations at the core level. Whereas it seems like the Dutch approach has kind of kept those out of both base and core. I think we could probably dive more deeply once we get another example of the use case implementation one, but it's interesting, I think, to say that like we might have more than one approach to consider when we try to narrow down what our sweet spot might be. So our folks interested, and I'm looking at the top of the hour, the next time we're going to meet for governance will be what would that be? The 17th? Yeah. Are we interested in like looking at an example that was going to be more of like an implementation of the core and seeing if we can find one that has like more of the constraints that we would expect to see if there's an equivalent to what we're seeing in our space?
It'd be nice to see that either we're getting along the same direction or not.
Yeah, I agree. It's going to be interesting to see an example.
Okay. So I'll see what I can find. And then in the meantime, we'll see if we can pin up that ask to the folks from Australia, specifically around clarifying if there is a better example other than like the Australian patient summary that we should be looking at to describe the relationship between base core and like an implementation guide that's in use. All right, so the conversation will continue. I would say if there are others that folks want to look at in the meantime, like if you guys find in your own scans that there are other countries that should make it on our list or other approaches for consideration, please let us know and we'll add them to the kind of the next few rounds of governance calls that we have. But I think our goal should probably be to have this, oh, this is how other folks are doing it. And then on each of those modalities that we're scanning for, start to form a point of view on what we think is maybe preferable for that approach in the baseline. So that's how I'm seeing some of the kind of the next calls naturally rolling out, but I will look to you guys if you want to take a slightly different approach to that. But that will have to be